Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Testing Peers. We have a mixture of people here today, so let me introduce you to the crew that we've got on tonight, or this morning, or whatever. So I'll start with David.
Hello.
And Chris.
Hey. Hello. Hi.
Oh, multiples. And our special guest, Jon.
Hello.
Before I go on, I'll just read a little message from our sponsor. So Saffron QA continue to be our sponsor. We are so lucky. Thank you, Saffron QA. They support the testing community. So any of our listeners are in the market for a new job in testing or hiring new talent for your team, reach out to Ben. He's a great guy. He can be contacted at ben@saffronqa.co.uk. So please do reach out if you need anything there. This week, we're going to talk about meetings. I think we were all discussing previously about the joys that we all face at work. So meeting meh. Before we go into meeting and meh, let's have a little bit of banter. So over to you, Jon.
So I'm going to go with something that kind of leads into our topic. What is the wildest or craziest meeting that you've had to be a part of? And cringe factor absolutely works well here too.
I've certainly been in meetings that have had absolutely no context. We just sort of rocked up, then even the name made no sense. And then it felt like a public shaming of one person who also didn't know this was going to be happening. And I've been messaging folks in the background going, do you know what this is about? And you start having these sort of back of the room conversations trying to work out, why is this? This feels really awful, to the point where I've had to go and then speak to certain individuals afterwards to express the sheer discomfort that I experienced, let alone the people who were being shamed. That's a horrible thing. Meetings without context are dreadful regardless, but using a meeting to publicly shame people, unless they deserve it, toxic leaders or whatever maybe, but even still, not cool, really wild, really uncomfortable, really awkward. Never want to have those sorts of things in my life.
Mine's a little bit similar, but it's those meetings where a manager has asked someone else to create the meeting. But again, it's similar to Chris's, is that there's no context. So you turn up at this meeting and no one's actually quite sure what the meeting is actually about, not even the person who originally asked the meeting, who is there as well. And so there's a sort of an awkward silence until someone actually says, well, what are we actually trying to do here? Then it forms a plan as it works. And there's always that sort of feeling that you've wasted a lot of time because actually, is it actually going to be valuable? Because no one actually had a plan as part of it. So yeah, that's my most frustrating or annoying meeting, I would say.
My problem is cutting it down to one. Got the inappropriate meetings where people have said inappropriate things in front of other people. I've got the ones where people have nearly fought. Certainly there've been shouting matches. But the one that probably stands out is where leaders come in and kind of like set their stall out, but it completely contradicts the culture and the organization beneath them. And it's just kind of like, oh, read the room. It's like, oh, this is a car crash. And you're kind of sitting there just having to listen, not being able to do anything whilst they preach for like 20, 30 minutes, something that every other leader and every other part of the organization is trying to move away from. I just found that quite cringy. It's very hard to deal with at times.
Yeah, I've got another example is where, because obviously we work with clients, and sometimes within the client meeting, the client then has a disagreement, so they have their own argument in front of us.
And it's the most awkward thing sometimes because you're like, I really shouldn't be here, guys. Yeah. No, I will do you all one better. And it's only ever happened one time, and God forbid, I hope it never happens again. But I was working for an energy trading division of a power company back in the mid 2000s. And we're in a meeting one time, and all of a sudden everything just went silent. And you see people starting to stand up, turn around. And so we're in a meeting room that looked out over the trading floor, and you could see, like, they have rows and rows of traders on the floor working, and you just see everybody kind of stand up and then part. And the FBI had shown up to escort multiple of our traders out for insider trading and price fixing. So that really derailed that meeting, because then they came in and got one of the executives out of the meeting that we were in. It was a little awkward that day and the rest of that week.
Were there any NDAs?
There were no NDAs. It was all public knowledge. This was back loosely related to the Enron scandal. If you guys remember that from the States, this was kind of blowback on some of the smaller players that were individual traders at certain companies that were in on things or taking advantage of things. And it just became a really weird, awkward situation that, yeah, I got out of there. Just different kind of company after that.
But don't we all love meetings?
We do. What's your favorite meeting? Let's talk positively. Let's start on a nice note.
Well, start with a good meeting.
Yes. There must be good meetings.
The one that's not scheduled.
Not the one when the boss just chops and says, time for a chat. And you're like, so you start freaking out because they ain't fun.
Well, no, and the worst of those are when that's just their personality, and yet you have somebody on the other end that doesn't know that. And so they do that, and then you get to the meeting, you're like, am I getting let go or fired or what's going on? No, I just wanted to catch up. Like, how's things going? Dude, you can't come in like that. Like, that's not how you start.
I'd like a good meeting. A good meeting for me always comes with an explicit purpose, and there's the right people in it. It's very clear. We know what we're trying to achieve in the meeting. I spoke in a very early episode, maybe even episode number 2. I spoke about how much I enjoy one-to-ones with the right people. Those meetings are often ones I really look forward to. I don't even feel like they're meetings. I love it. I love those sorts of sessions with people where it's folks either you're invested in their progression and development or they're invested in yours. Then you get to sort of plot and come up with cool ways to collaborate and stuff. That's really exciting. I like those ones. That's probably my favorite kind.
Yeah, or you talk about Football Manager.
Yeah, these things are important for human connections, obviously.
Yeah. I would agree. I think that productive, valuable meetings that come out with some good outcome are absolutely the best meetings. That are well run, actually, and it can be, you can use those liberating structures to mix it up a little bit, but as long as it's carefully sort of managed and explained, then actually whatever the meeting or the structure of the meeting can be very collaborative and great. I think those sort of meetings are my favorite and best. Unfortunately, they don't always end up like that.
No, I think it's a culture thing. I mean, to me, to your point, the collaborative ones, the ones where everyone that's there is participating. To me, the worst thing is when you go into a meeting and half to 2/3 of the room stay silent while the rest of you discuss something. Why are they there? Like, that doesn't make sense to me.
I like what everyone's saying, to be honest. It's outcomes, people contributing, the right attendance sort of thing. But I'll add one thing into the mix. I prefer in person.
Yeah.
Don't be wrong. I can't do in person across the globe and all that sort of stuff. But if I have a choice, we happen to be in the same city. I'd rather have in person in a coffee shop or formal meetings if necessary. But I'd rather have that if possible. But it's not always the right thing.
I was going to say that was going to be my question for you was, do you feel like that's applicable for all kinds of meetings, or just do you find certain ones do better in one style or the other?
If it's a couple of people, it's quite easy to get people in a room together. When you get big, like get 100 people into a room, I think it's just bad no matter what. There's no longer a meeting anymore if you've got 100 people.
Yeah, it's a town hall.
Yeah, I don't know what the level where the criteria gets, but I think it's more than 7. And it starts becoming less of a meeting, more of a show and tell talk, town hall.
A broadcast or something.
Yeah, and the value diminishes in terms of participation. It doesn't mean it doesn't have value, but it does mean that the type of value you get out of that is different.
I think it depends on the participation, because actually in a town hall, a face-to-face allows it easier to actually ask questions.
It actually is. Yeah, people are more willing to do that, whereas they feel like they can hide on a Zoom call.
Yeah. And actually might well not actually be fully engaged, because you can hide behind what you actually do. You can be getting on with work, whereas actually it's much more obvious face-to-face.
I was going to say that one of the things that I would also say that I probably enjoy most in a meeting is, whether it's remote and therefore it would be slightly different, but a meeting that doesn't involve a screen.
Yeah.
If I was having a one-to-one and I'm remote, make it a phone call, go for a walk. If I'm in person, not looking at a screen and maybe looking at the other human in the room, or using Post-its and like brainstorming with sort of more tactile, physical sorts of things. Those things I almost always enjoy more than an actual screen. And I've had one-to-ones in person where the other person's been on a laptop making notes the whole time, and I hated that thing. I didn't like it because it drew attention. I understand why people take notes for one-to-ones or for any other meetings, but for me, it draws attention away. Just to the point of the previous point, I would rather not have to look at a screen to be in a meeting. Sometimes I really enjoy
It's hard
those.
that, because some people like me, if I write it in by hand, I'd lose it. If I don't write it down, I forget it.
Oh, totally.
So I was actually going to ask this question because it's something that I've experimented really in the last 6, 7 months with, because I've had various conversations with various people. I'm massively ADHD. And so the minute you tell me something, I forget it. Doesn't matter how important or minute it is. Chris can absolutely attest to that part. I started using a tool called Fireflies, which is one of these AI based recording apps that listen in on your conversation. And then at the end, gives you a transcript, notes, action items, key takeaways, key points to remember. It's been great. I want it for every meeting I ever go into now, because it's changed. To your point, Chris, people no longer have to stare at a screen. They can have a natural flowing conversation without worrying about who's keeping track of what's been said, or what are the takeaways, or what are the action items, who's responsible for what. None of that has to occur. Everybody that's on the meeting at the end of it gets an email that says, this is the nature of the conversation. Here's who's responsible for what, and you're done. To me, that's been the greatest advancement for meetings, really, in ever.
But dare I say it, some meetings don't need minutes or action items. Some
I
meetings, the conversation and those bits are more important. And by all means, a lot of meetings need action items and things.
But I think one of the things that gets lost in those kinds of meetings, because those are very important. Sometimes they're not going to have action items that come out of them, but you're trying to work towards an outcome. One of the things that happens, especially with people like me or even Geraint, right, that we meander a lot in the course of those kinds of conversations, because we're trying to work through a problem that we don't necessarily know the answer to, or know the direction the answer is going to be in. And so, yes, there's not going to be a takeaway from it outside of we came to a conclusion, but having the how we got there and the details and all the topics, because sometimes we touch on things that actually do require a whole separate conversation. That's just as important to remember that 30 minutes into a 4-hour conversation, that happened. And you guys think that's hyperbole. That actually was a very real thing.
I believe it.
But there were some things that came out of those things that were massively important for us to remember to come back to. We just happened to touch on them and went, oh yeah, we need to come back to that. But we would have never remembered to do that.
I have often those rambling conversations as well. And I guess there's different types of meetings. We've talked upon it. There's kind of town halls, there's kind of formal meetings, catch-ups, reviews, one-to-ones. You've got the conversation between two people. That's often, in this day and age, it's a meeting, isn't it? You book in time or you get on a call. It's a form of meeting. It's interesting how, I actually really enjoy those types of meetings where you're just free-flowing it, creating ideas, discussing things. I got off one just before this call to a degree. It's interesting because we also said we want meetings with outcomes. It was one of the things that we all said we prefer to a degree. It's interesting how we're a contradiction to ourselves.
It is
type of meeting.
But one of the things that when you said the different types of meetings, when COVID hit, for example, we shut our office down. And the biggest thing we missed wasn't the meetings per se, but it was those hallway conversations, those ones that didn't really have a structure to them, because the thing that it brought was that camaraderie and the social aspect.
I want to go back to the conversation we were having about sort of recording meetings, and we've got people at work who've got these remarkables, which is the handwriting things, which I think is very useful, and it sort of blurs that line between keep making notes and not having a computer. I think that also on online meetings I have OneNote open, and I often have better minutes on an online meeting because I can listen and summarize the meetings and keep a note on that, rather than face to face. I don't feel right in writing notes down because you're looking down and not engaging with the actual person. Yeah. And as a third point for Chris's point, I've been in meetings where we are doing a retrospective, but even though we are all in the room, we have been doing it on a Miro board because we want to share it and keep it. It's easier to keep than if it was elsewhere, which rather sort of defeats the object of being in the room. But actually, so it's really difficult to sort of blur those lines. But I completely understand, Chris, you're saying about not having.
It's it's the context thing which we always come back to. I don't hate actions and meetings and those, but the certain ones when it just feels inappropriate. I do take notes quite often with post-its, and I throw them all around. Me, that's how for me at least. If I've written it down, I'm probably going to remember it. It's the way my brain works. So I have notebooks that I write into, and I never read back ever again. But because I actually tangibly wrote them down, it's worked for me.
Yeah, it's the one trigger that I have to remember that there's something I need to remember. What that thing is, that's an open question mark. But there's a trigger that I need to remember something.
It's like the string on your finger.
Yeah.
But I did it a while back, probably nearly 3 years ago. Actually, when I worked for Jon, listener, I came up with a course where we talked about some of the things that we thought were important for meetings. It was threefold. It was planning, facilitation, and actions. And the planning bit, which is the bit I've already spoken about, that I strongly dislike, is meetings that don't have an explicit purpose, the right people, expected outcomes, and actually establish goals. What do we expect to achieve in these sorts of sessions? And then the facilitation's about time boxing, a recap, a pre-cap. So getting ahead of the game, making the best use of our time, having icebreakers like we do every episode of this podcast. Read the room, check out who's engaged, who isn't engaged. If folks aren't working, let's try and change. We shouldn't have dominators of the conversation. So after I've done all of this talking, I'll be quiet. have a car park, have a means of something to put stuff back in. You know, people, I hate when people say, "Oh, let's take the offline," and then nothing ever happens. Actually, do stuff about that. And then the actions, that your credibility of your session, if you're going to have a recurring session, or even if you're just trying to get sort of allies or buy-in on various things. If you've got actions that have been outcomes of the meetings, the sessions, the catch-ups that you've had, if you've got those actual tangible outcomes that you can point to, say, we did this is the outcome of those things, you've got some sort of fuel to get future buy-in and stuff. And so I like the idea of recapping what you've done. So even when I've had sessions where we've been screenless, I've sat then and then I've written down some high-level notes and said, this is what I've remembered from the session. Let's get ourselves on the same page. And then we've got them, and then we can share those sorts of things in. So I hope I haven't contradicted myself too much, but in terms of those sorts of goals, that's what I was kind of aiming for an ideal thing. And I'm just as guilty as anyone else of not always following their own advice. But that's what I think is a good initial sort of recipe for a successful meeting.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Having clear next steps, even if it's not like an action item or something tangible, just what is next? We had this discussion. What happens next? That I think is often missing from probably half the meetings that I go to, like on a regular basis. Doesn't matter what company it is, doesn't matter the nature of the conversation. The thing that by and large tends to be forgotten. What's the next steps? What is the next thing from here? And nobody likes to ask like that. That's the worst part, is nobody likes to be like, okay, so what do we do next? Because it feels like a sales guy.
You just reminded me of one of the worst meetings I remember. Not a sales meeting. No, it was an escalation to like a CTO, CEO sort of thing. And he came in and he kind of listened, like, well, what's the problem? Blah, blah, blah. And at the end of it, right, okay, gotta go, bye. We've just summarized the problem and then you'd leave. Great. That was valuable. Yeah. No one got anything out of that meeting. But yeah, I think it's a very good point about kind of the outcome doesn't need to be an action, but it is next step. There's got to be a purpose or a point to getting together, value.
Exactly.
And you've got to show that.
But I think that the reason that people don't necessarily answer the question is because they don't want to be saddled with the action item.
So that right there is exactly that. That is actually a very valid point. There's a lot of people that won't ask that question, even if they're leading the meeting, because they don't want the responsibility of taking and making sure the next step gets done. Because, we're as much as we'd like to all say we're all adults, we're not all adults when it comes to this kind of stuff.
But no, and we're all busy as well. And
absolutely.
If it's not your priority, then, if you've been asked.
Then it's not your concern.
Then it's not your concern, no.
Yeah. And that's not nothing against the person that called it or the action that needs to be done or anything else. It's just the reality of the fact that we're all probably massively overworked and we're lucky to get through the week as it is.
Yeah, the amount of meetings.
Speaks to a lot of disillusionment as well, right? Have you ever
Yeah.
been to a retrospective where you heard the same thing more than once in the next one? And that's because people bring up these reasons for these things that were needed improvement or they weren't working. They make a note of it, but no one owns those things. No one takes those bits for whatever reason. And then people's belief in the credibility of the Scrum framework or whatever they're utilizing at the time has gone. What's the point in me investing my time in raising issues if nothing's ever done about it?
Or I'll take the action item, but if I don't do it, there's no ramification for me not doing it. That's just as damaging.
No accountability. Accountability is a big thing, and we don't do enough of it. But the Scrum one you mentioned there always amuses me because sometimes I've seen Scrum teams like talk about the entire company culture. It's like, yeah, because that's an actionable item that you can change in a sprint. You need to think about kind of what we do. It's like we need to hire new people. It's like, okay, again, long term, great. That's going to be a long term thing. That's not going to change the world tomorrow. What can we do to help? And some of it's about coaching and facilitating to not ignore the long term strategic changes, because that's the worst thing as well. But at the same time, think about what's in your scope, what's in your power. Same goes with meetings in general. Taking actions and all the rest of it. If everyone in that meeting just stays silent when someone asks about an action, okay, then you're not invested in the problem or the action is not appropriate. Someone has to own.
It also, to the same point, it also goes back to you just being quiet. If you're there, there's probably a reason you were invited. Participation in general, maybe that action item is not necessary if you were to speak up and have that conversation, but
no one challenges it.
Nobody challenges it. You might be able to solve that problem and put it into it right then and there. But because your personality is one, or you don't feel empowered to stand up, because that's a real thing too, right? You could be a quiet type person, but it could be that you don't feel like you're allowed to say anything in that meeting. I've been in cases where both myself and others that I've watched have raised a solution that would have solved the problem, only to get chewed out by leadership or their manager for speaking out of turn and suggesting something that hadn't been vetted yet.
Yeah, there's some toxic leaders out there.
I think you highlight a good point, is that the sort of quiet people need to be able to have a voice. So if you're leading the meeting, to actually encourage them or make sure that they don't have something that they would like to say. And that might be either in the meeting or even after the meeting, if they look like they want something to say, but don't find it as sort of psychologically safe space.
A well-facilitated meeting will be inclusive and allow everyone on their own space, safe space for being able to share.
Very few of those, Chris, in reality, though, isn't there?
There is, and I think that brings up another aspect of it, where you have people that have been invited to a meeting because they have the expertise to fix and solve the problem, but they are not empowered to make decisions on their own. And that will prevent them, even if they could, they know the answer. Absolutely. They also know they're not allowed to say it because they haven't talked to their boss about it.
You know what else we're not allowed to say, John? Is we're not allowed to say we're fixing a problem. We've got an opportunity to improve on this current situation, because fixing sounds like it's broken, but we're not broken. We just need to improve and iterate, because we are not allowed to use negative language now, John.
Yeah. You've clearly never been in one of my meetings then.
Maybe that's where you learned it.
We do everything the very politically correct way and very, very uplifting of spirits. Yeah.
A lot of this stuff, though, like the rights and wrongs, the balance, it's balancing acts, isn't it? It's all about trying to read the audience, read the room, read the virtual room, find the halfway house, try and get engagement of people, try and make sure that anyone who's too loud, too aggressive or vocal is kind of guided away from that. That voices are heard, but constructively versus destructively. That space is given, people's opinions are asked, things like that. And I must admit, if I'm chairing a meeting or anything else, find it virtually in the virtual space, I find it really, really challenging when there's no cameras on. There is no feedback loop for me on whether people are engaged, paying attention, whether they agree, disagree, and you're in effect maybe the only one on camera trying to speak to an empty room. It gets really, really hard to make effective meetings. I use an analogy with my colleagues a lot, which is, would you walk into a meeting with a paper bag over your head? You wouldn't generally. going to online meetings where you turn off the camera, there's always occasions where it makes sense, don't get me wrong. But the majority of the time, don't matter what your background is. Doesn't matter how your hair messy is. You're also going to work.
Isn't that a level of respect thing, though, that I think so I do see this as a generational thing to some degree, and kind of the expectations that come along with that, and just the appropriateness of work culture and things that are and are not appropriate, or just the level of respect that something conveys or that you give to another person. And I think there's some generational differences there in terms of expectations.
It's interesting because I've never thought of it generationally. I have thought of it individually, and maybe it's generations, maybe it's individuals, maybe it's cultural. It could be all sorts of different combinations. But yeah, I know people that would go to job interviews in pajamas these days and a shirt on top, whereas I would find that weird.
I wouldn't be able to do it mentally.
Yeah, mentally wouldn't get me in the right place. But,
Yeah.
you know, some people always have to wear suits. Some people want to dress down casually. You got IT entrepreneurs who wear shorts in the office, no matter if it's 10 degrees or, 90 degrees.
Chris knows what I wear in the office all the time. I just wear sweatpants. But I do think there's a cultural piece to it that I think we find funny. The world has changed from when, I came up and virtual meetings that's just not a thing. Like, we don't do that. You come to the office. If you're not in the office, you're not included. That was a reality. Like a virtual meeting was a real headache for those involved. You had to find a conference phone. You had to figure out a way, if you were sharing content on a screen, you had to figure out a way to do. And so the world has changed in that regard, and that's all great. You've also got people that have grown up with the technology as opposed to learning it in a professional environment with some structure around expectations. If you've grown up with something, you use something in a totally different way than if you were taught how to use it. And I think that I watch my kids, I watch them and how they interact with technology even today versus the previous generation. Like, people laughed when I said 10 years ago, the computer curriculum that we were teaching then wasn't going to be relevant because the things that the kids at that point growing up were going to be using were all going to be touch-based. And it is. Like, kids today would prefer to use touch-based interactions. And that's just because that's what they've known. So I see how it impacts, that mindset impacts meetings and the people that participate in them. You go back and watch it. Some of them are funny, but man, Instagram has some really spot on mimicries and memes about meeting attendees and how people on the other side of the camera are acting. And most of them are generational based.
There's also a thing about comfort, isn't there? Like, so I understand, like, I always prefer cameras on. I leave my camera on. I'm very comfortable with people too.
Yeah, you just leave it on all day.
Yeah, man, I don't care. But I do understand, like, some people aren't very comfortable with seeing themselves on a camera. I have family members that will refuse to be on camera and stuff. It's what you're comfortable with. It's what you're used to. But I do think as leaders, we have to set an example that isn't a pressured, like an uncomfortable pressured example, but an example to say that I'm easy and comfortable with these things. I would prefer it if we got to engage with humans with feedback. And whenever I've done virtual talks and stuff, I've always invited people to speak and to put their camera on to give me like nodding feedback and stuff, because it's been reassuring and helpful for me. But I also understand that other people have got different needs and requirements and stuff. But for me, the camera on is actually, more than anything else, it's a keeping me accountable kind of thing. Because if my camera's on and I'm looking, I'm not on my phone. I'm not picking my nose or chomping away on some food or whatever. Like, it's a thing for me that helps me to feel like I'm actually speaking to other humans rather than just, there's voices going on in the background that I'm clearly not paying attention to.
I'll tell you a specific example from last week where I was on a call with somebody and having a conversation, and they know my ADHD-ness. They know the nature of my distracted, and we're having a conversation, and I started drifting off looking at something else, and they go, "Hey, you're doing something other than talking to me, aren't you?" And like called me out on it. And that was great. I don't mind that because I know that that's me. That's my personality. Some people would not do well with that. I get that, but I find it refreshing. I think it's good if we're not paying attention.
We're human, though, aren't we? Ultimately, if you're in a meeting and you drifted off, or you got lost focus and were staring out the window and didn't seem to be hearing what was going on. It wouldn't have been too uncommon just someone to say your name or something like that, just to bring you back into the space.
Happens all the time in meetings.
Yeah, but it is interesting because it's like a lot of these things. It's about leading by example. It's about articulating the context. Like, it's beneficial to me if, rather than saying, everyone, you must turn your camera on. It's kind of leading positively, I guess, is the way. Explaining it, articulating, because often people don't understand the impact. So if you explain it, especially people you're new to, less so people you're not new to. But yeah, it does make sense. But I do find this, have to say, that the meetings where you get to see people reactions, even if they're dozing off, I don't mind. That's fine. If they're wearing their gym jams, the pajamas, again, I'm not that bothered. It's the work that gets done. What you're wearing doesn't really make a difference unless it's possibly client-facing impression. But my work now doesn't have that sort of client reaction.
But it has a lot of feedback for you as well, right? On this podcast a lot, people nod along with you and go, yeah. And you get that sort of affirmation that what you're saying is resonating with people. And people don't have to go, or yes, and make David or yourselves editing pad.
The exact opposite, when they're making funny faces and it becomes clear that they don't quite understand what you're talking about. You now can course correct a little bit and maybe re-explain what it is you were trying to convey, because you know somebody wasn't getting it, whereas you can't see them. You just, how often do you get on a conversation like that and it's a presentation, for example, and it just becomes a dry, monotonous read that isn't interesting.
I often over-explain this, say it 3 times because I don't know if someone's understood.
Yeah.
I can see their reaction, they've understood.
Yeah.
I might only say it twice. But you can also see when people want to talk. So I will shut up and see if anyone else does.
Who can do this? Hand up.
We even tried post-it notes at one point, didn't we?
There were cue cards and stuff, weren't there,
Yeah.
for calls? Or you're on mute was one of those cards, wasn't it?
Yeah, and we had a talking stick for people that would talk. They would grab it out of the middle of the table until they got their turn to talk, and then put it back in the middle. And the next person, so if the talking stick was in play, start wrapping up because somebody else is ready to talk.
I've got a question. It's probably the last one. How do you cope with people that love the sound of their own voices, so therefore they really dominate the conversation, and therefore, if you're facilitating, you're having to listen, you have to cut through the noise in order to get to the point, but then they start again. How do you cope with people in those meetings?
I don't know. How do you cope with me, David?
I just wait for you to finish, and then
I was just going to ask Chris the same thing. How did he deal with me?
To be honest, bluntness.
I like to give people room. Like if it's constructive and productive and it's not wasting time, I'm game for it. I do appreciate sometimes these things do overrun, and but everyone's guilty of those things. And I think as a facilitator rather than a leader, your goal is to try and say, right, that look for a tiny gap in speech. Maybe they're taking a breath in, but okay, well let's leave that there. And we'll sort of move on and try to find ways try to find a way to let people know that they're heard, because normally people are talking a lot because they want to be heard, because they've got a lot to talk about, rather than just let's fill the meeting time with stuff. Like, it is still important to them, and it's important for them to know that they are heard. So allowing that to have taken place is important. This comes back to the sort of setting the expectations of the meeting. This is what we're going to try and achieve. Let's try and say for the next X amount of time, we'll be trying to achieve this sort of thing, and then we'll do it. So like on-screen indicators like clocks, timers, or audible things on your phone that can go off, where you can go, right, we're done with that now. That's great. Like that classic sort of lean coffee way of doing things is quite a nice bit. And then I love that in lean coffee, right? People talk a lot, and then you can do the thumbs up and thumbs down sort of. Maybe we've gone too far with that. But the other thing, I guess, is in retrospect to speak to either the people who didn't get the chance to speak, because sometimes they maybe didn't feel they could in the wider meeting, or to the person that sort of dominated the session, and make sure they're okay. Like, is there anything else they need to sort of cover? Because I don't think just shutting up people is actually the right approach.
And I think this is a challenge. I mean, I'm one of those people. I don't do it because I like the sound of my own voice. I do it because I have a lot of words to say, and I think of a lot of things, and I just need to get them out. But one of the things that has helped me, I mentioned the AI note taker tool that I have. One of the most useful things that has helped me with, though, is understanding how much I'm the main speaker in a conversation. and how much I'm sharing that conversational load, and was it appropriate for the type of conversation that it was. For me, that's been really helpful, because sometimes it took me a while to realize I was just talking too much, and to the point where I had bosses finally just tell me, you have to stop. Like, okay, we'll get back to you. I get it.
Yeah, I get it as well. I often tell people to shut me up in meetings where I think I'm talking a lot. I've become self-aware enough, which helps, but obviously that's not always the case. But if I'm honest, it's sometimes is about redirecting. It's about facilitating. It's about recapping. So to Chris's point, I think a little bit, which is when someone's got a lot to say, sometimes, like in my case, I could be repeating myself just because I'm not sure people get me. So repeating it so that shows that someone gets you, it kind of helps you kind of feel heard. So actually you do pipe down and listen to other people, because at least one person in the room's acknowledged what you said and so on. But it is sometimes like trying to draw people in if they feel comfortable. Again, if you know your audience, it's easier, I should say. If you have a room full of people you don't know, it's very hard to draw the people in.
There's also that little piece when no one's talking, and so then you feel like you need to fill that uncomfortable silence by talking more.
Yeah.
Yes. And that seems a perfect time to finish off this conversation. And no, I haven't got time, Russell.
Very nicely done. Very nicely done.
So thank you very much for a really, really enjoyable conversation. Thank you, John, Chris, and Russell. Yeah. It's been really great and a great start to the new year. So just to thank you so much for listening. Please do reach out to us. We're available by email through ContactUs@testingpeers.com. You can get us on all the social media channels, or you can meet up with us at the Testing Peers conference, which should be in about 10 weeks' time. Do get your tickets. Do go to testingpeerscon.com in order to get your tickets and to see what the schedule is actually going to be like and what the wonderful speakers we've got there. So please do get in touch in whatever way you want to. And if you are coming to the conference, we will look forward to seeing you there then. But thank you very much for listening, and thank you for Saffron QA, and we'll catch up with you soon.
For now, it's goodbye from the Testing Peers.
Goodbye.